The first story I want to share was on one of my shifts. I was early on at the Respite Center, and my coworker Bev and I were on a shift with these two boys. And one of the boys, he was 5 years old, and he had been through a lot. He had disclosed to us that his father had passed and he was grieving, and he shared some experiences that sound like he might have witnessed some domestic violence as well. And so he was processing a lot. And at one point, while he was playing, something flipped and a switch, and I'm not sure what the trigger was. Sometimes you just don't know, but he started acting out and throwing toys, getting pretty aggressive with his younger brother. And Bev responded by very calmly offering that they go on a walk and kind of help him take a break from the space that was causing him some stress. So they left the childcare area at the Respite Center, and they walked down the halls around the Rise building. And as they were walking down the halls, they made their way to a room that has a fish tank. And Bev started asking the little boy, "How many fish do you see?" And he starts counting them. "What colors are the fish?" And he starts labeling the colors. And after a little while, when he seemed to be kind of settling a little, she asked if he was ready to go back, and he was. And when they were ready to start walking back, she said, "No, do you remember which way? Did we turn right or did we turn left?" And he started, remembering and guiding the directions back. And the reason this was so important is that Bev did all of this so intentionally. She explained later to me that when he was acting out, he was his brain was very focused on the amygdala, that fear center of the brain, which is the fight or flight response, which can happen to kids. Like, they might have a trigger and suddenly their brain is like going back to a really stressful time. And by moving him from that situation and having him label the fish, counting them, the colors, and leading directions back, she was having him kind of refocus his brain towards his executive functioning, his control, his critical thinking, his judgment. And through doing so, she was able to help him regulate emotionally. And it was just very intentional, and she was able to respond to his needs. And I just think that story really goes to show the training we have as childcare specialists. And my next story is something that also happened on one of my shifts. There was a 13-year-old girl who showed up at the Respite Center, and she had a very extensive trauma background. She experienced so much for just a kid. And when she arrived, it was her grandma who was dropping her off, and her grandma and her were arguing, and it was getting pretty escalated at drop off. And eventually they parted ways. Grandma left, and this child, the 13-year-old girl, her response was withdrawing. And she withdrew to a corner and just kind of sat very quietly. And I knew that a lot of times when we see kids who are withdrawing, it doesn't necessarily mean they want you to ignore them. It means that a lot of times they're trying to test you. They've seen a lot of caregivers or adults abandon them. And it's almost like a way to test their trust with you. So I grabbed some coloring supplies. I sat by her and just kind of kept her company, waited for an opportunity to connect. And eventually her chair squeaks. And I say to her, "Don't you hate it when your chair squeaks and it sounds like you farted?" And it totally broke the ice. She started laughing. And from then on forward, we were chatty and having a good time and talking about the middle school drama and baking some muffins. And then suddenly her demeanor changes and she tells me, "I'm feeling really guilty." And I asked her why she was feeling that way. And she told me it was because she was yelling at her grandma, and it was because she said she didn't think she was going to have a good time here, so she didn't want her grandma to drop her off here. But now that she was having a really good time, she was feeling guilty for having yelled at her grandma. And I told her, you should not feel guilty for that, because how would you have known otherwise? Like, you had no idea you were going to have a good time here, so it's really not your fault. Like, you should not feel bad about that. You had no idea. And I said, if it makes you feel better, though, you could always talk to your grandma and check in and see how you're feeling, talk about how you're feeling now. And when her grandma showed up about an hour later, the 13-year-old girl went running to the grandma and giving her this big hug. And I just felt like that moment was so, sorry, there's a dog barking next door. So I felt like that moment was just so impactful, because it just really showed a family that was very escalated at drop off, and how having that respite break was just so important for them to come back together and offer that stability. And it just was such a really beautiful experience getting to witness that.